On December 17, 1944, a massive German armored column found exactly what it had been advancing blindly in search of: an intact American depot holding roughly 50,000 gallons of gasoline. The soldiers eagerly refueled their vehicles and pushed forward again, convinced they had secured the lifeblood needed to sustain their offensive. It looked like a decisive victory. Yet, within just a few days, this same powerful force would be completely paralyzed. How can an army capture exactly what it lacks and still grind to a halt within days, forced to abandon almost all of its heavy equipment? The answer begins at the very tip of the German spear: Kampfgruppe Peiper. Commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a rank roughly equivalent to a lieutenant colonel, this was a massively powerful, heavily equipped combat formation. It was designed specifically to act as the armored forward striking force of the German offensive in the northern Ardennes. Peiper's orders were uncompromising. He was not expected to fight prolonged engagements or slowly reduce enemy strongpoints. His primary weapon was supposed to be speed. His mission was to smash a hole through the American lines and drive relentlessly westward to seize the vital crossings over the Meuse River. But this massive armored fist possessed a fatal vulnerability before its engines even roared to life. Germany simply did not have enough gasoline to sustain a prolonged offensive. The entire operational timetable relied on a desperate gamble. German tanks had to run on American fuel. Peiper's battle group was explicitly expected to sustain its rapid advance by overrunning and capturing Allied supply depots along the route. When his men secured those 50,000 gallons of gasoline, it felt like the ultimate vindication of that high-stakes strategy. But as we trace the path of this armored spearhead, we will see how this captured prize initially appeared capable of saving the entire operation, only to become undeniable proof that the offensive was already doomed. When the Ardennes offensive erupted out of the winter fog, the sheer mechanical weight of Kampfgruppe Peiper was intended to break the American lines through overwhelming brute force. This was not a standard infantry division trudging through the snow. This was a concentrated battering ram of elite armor, explicitly designed to maximize shock and violence of action. At its core were dozens of Panzer IVs and Panther tanks, machines built for rapid exploitation. But the true terror of the formation was the heavy armor battalion attached to it, equipped with the formidable Tiger II, widely known as the King Tiger. Weighing nearly 70 tons, the King Tiger was a monstrous piece of engineering. Its frontal armor was virtually impenetrable to standard Allied anti-tank weapons, and its 88mm gun could destroy any American tank at distances long before the enemy could even close into effective range. Behind this armored vanguard followed thousands of combat-hardened mechanized infantry riding in armored half-tracks, supported by self-propelled artillery and mobile anti-aircraft guns. Stretched out, this battle group formed a steel column miles long, an unstoppable juggernaut that struck a sector of the American line held by exhausted, green, or vastly outnumbered troops who never expected a winter offensive. The element of surprise was absolute. Yet, beneath the terrifying exterior of this armored beast lay a critical, almost absurd vulnerability. The entire German military apparatus in late 1944 was suffering from a catastrophic starvation of oil. Allied strategic bombing campaigns had systematically pulverized synthetic fuel plants and refineries, leaving the Third Reich running on fumes. Kampfgruppe Peiper was the spearhead of Hitler's last great gamble in the West, yet it was sent into battle with an agonizingly short logistical leash. The high command could only scrape together enough gasoline to get the tanks partway to their ultimate objective. To bridge the gap, the planners built a massive, desperate assumption directly into the operational blueprint. Peiper was explicitly ordered to live off the land. His forces were expected to overrun American supply dumps, siphon American fuel, and consume Allied rations to sustain their own momentum. This was a fundamental violation of basic military logistics. Germany was entirely outsourcing the supply chain of its premier striking force to the very enemy it was trying to destroy. Every mile the King Tigers drove depended on the absolute certainty that they would capture fuel before their own gauges hit empty. And these machines were incredibly thirsty. A 70-ton King Tiger could easily consume up to 2 gallons of fuel for every single mile traveled on a flat, paved road. In the muddy, steep inclines of the Ardennes, Fighting in low gear, that consumption rate skyrocketed. The engines literally drank gasoline faster than any conventional supply line could replace it. Without a constant, massive influx of captured fuel, the most powerful armored formation in the world would simply become a collection of very heavy steel bunkers. And the terrain itself magnified this vulnerability to a fatal degree. The geography of the Ardennes region is inherently hostile to mechanized warfare. It is a landscape defined by deep, plunging river valleys, dense, impenetrable pine forests, and steep, rocky ridgelines. Peiper's assigned route, designated as Rollbahn D, was not a paved, multi-lane highway capable of handling military convoys. It was a miserable, winding network of narrow, muddy logging trails and single-lane macadam roads that clung to the edges of steep ravines. Heavy snow, freezing rain, and dense fog turned the unpaved sections into deep, churning quagmires of mud. The immense concentration of steel that made Kampfgruppe Peiper so deadly in open combat became a profound liability on these constricted forest paths. The massive vehicles constantly chewed up the very surfaces they were trying to use, quickly turning poor roads into impassable bogs for the wheeled supply trucks trailing behind. Thousands of vehicles were forced to string themselves out along a single, fragile artery. This geographical reality meant that the battle group could not leverage its numerical superiority or maneuver to outflank opposition. They were entirely confined to the road. On a single-lane track bordered by dense trees on one side and a steep drop-off on the other, an armored column ceases to be a flexible military unit and becomes a highly vulnerable queue. The physics of the traffic jam took hold. In this environment, a single point of failure at the very front of the column sends a paralyzing shockwave backward for miles. If a single tank slid off the icy road into a ditch, the entire offensive stopped until it could be recovered. If a half-track threw a tread, the units behind it were trapped. A solitary, well-placed American anti-tank gun hidden at a choke point could halt thousands of men until infantry could be brought forward to clear it. Furthermore, because of their enormous size, the heavy tanks could not simply turn around if the route was blocked. Drivers had to gingerly reverse 70 tons of steel along icy cliff edges in the pitch black. But the ultimate vulnerability, the Achilles heel of the entire German plan, was the bridges. The route crossed numerous rivers, streams, and deep gorges. Without those crossings, the narrow roads led nowhere. A single bridge, laced with explosives and detonated by retreating American engineers, could force the entire column to halt, reverse course, and seek long, agonizing detours that burned precious time and irreplaceable fuel. The conflict was set. Immense, terrifying striking power, bound to a rigid, fragile path, racing against a ticking fuel gauge. If the Americans could exploit the terrain, they could choke the beast without ever having to penetrate the frontal armor of a king tiger. Yet, in the chaotic opening hours of the offensive, the sheer violence of the German assault seemed to overwhelm these deep structural flaws. Peiper's armor ruthlessly smashed through the initial, thin American defenses, violently carving a path through the winter darkness. And when his lead elements successfully overran that massive American fuel dump on the second day of the attack, capturing exactly the prize they so desperately needed, it genuinely appeared as though the High Command's impossible logistical gamble was actually going to pay off. But the breakthrough to that massive prize had not come easily. Just 24 hours earlier, Peiper's juggernaut had been completely paralyzed near the tiny Belgian village of Lanzarote. There, a single platoon of American reconnaissance troops, dug into a snowy ridge, had held off an entire German paratrooper battalion for a full day. As the infantry failed to clear the route, Peiper's massive armored column was forced to sit idle in the freezing cold. Heavy tank engines burned precious gasoline just to keep their mechanical components from freezing, while the delay ate away at their strict operational timetable. Every stationary hour allowed the Americans to recover from the initial shock, and every drop of fuel burned while waiting brought the heavy armor closer to becoming static steel bunkers. When Peiper finally bullied his way to the front, forced the paratroopers forward, and broke through the American lines on the morning of December 17th, the pressure to make up for lost time was immense. The column surged westward, penetrating deep into the disorganized American rear. Then, near the town of Bulge, they found exactly what the operational blueprint demanded: Spread out before them was a sprawling American supply depot, largely intact and heavily stocked. Among the captured material was the ultimate prize, roughly 50,000 gallons of high-grade gasoline. To the German tank crews, this was not just a logistical victory, it was a physical salvation. 50,000 gallons meant that the immense Maybach engines of the King Tigers and Panthers could keep roaring. It meant the steel tracks would keep churning through the mud and snow. Tangibly, this captured fuel translated directly into miles of forward momentum. It was the absolute difference between stalling helplessly in the Ardennes forests and violently punching through to the vital bridges over the Meuse River. For a military force that had spent months starved of oil, rationing every drop for training and deployment, the sight of thousands of American jerry cans waiting to be tapped was intoxicating. At gunpoint, captured American soldiers were forced to help refuel the very tanks that were tearing their lines apart. Peiper's panzers drank their fill, topping off their internal tanks and lashing extra canisters to their armored hulls. As the heavy engines roared back to life, trailing thick clouds of exhaust in the winter air, German confidence reached its absolute zenith. The impossible gamble, designed by the High Command, was actually working. They had broken through. They had secured the lifeblood of the offensive, and they were moving fast. Nothing, it seemed, could stop the steel spearhead from reaching the river. But the reality of managing that captured fuel in the middle of a narrow, hostile environment was about to unravel the illusion of success. Capturing 50,000 gallons of gasoline is one thing. Actually getting it into the fuel tanks of a heavily armed combat formation, stretched out over miles of winding, muddy forest roads, is an entirely different mechanical nightmare. At Bulge, the German tank crews had stared at the massive stockpile of American fuel with elation, but that elation quickly collided with the physical reality of battlefield logistics. This was not a civilian filling station, equipped with high-pressure hoses and mechanical pumps. The captured American fuel was stored in heavy, 5-gallon jerry cans. 50,000 gallons meant dealing with 10,000 individual steel containers. Each can, weighing over 40 pounds when full, had to be manually lifted, uncapped, and poured into the armored vehicles. The internal fuel capacity of a 70-ton King Tiger tank was over 200 gallons, while a Panther tank held roughly 190. Filling just one of these steel leviathans required nearly 40 heavy cans to be carried through the freezing snow, hoisted up onto the rear engine deck, and emptied one by one through a funnel, often while spilling precious, highly flammable liquid onto the frozen metal in the bitter winter wind. Now, multiply that excruciating manual labor across a massive armored spearhead comprising dozens of heavy tanks, assault guns, and armored half-tracks. But the friction of the process was even worse than the labor itself. Because Kampfgruppe Peiper was confined to a narrow, single-lane road network, the battle group was strung out over 15 miles. The heavy tanks at the very rear of the column could not simply drive up to the depot. There was absolutely no room to bypass the massive vehicles idling in front of them. The fuel had to be brought to them. Supply trucks were dispatched to load the captured cans and carefully thread their way backward down the muddy shoulders of the congested road, while exhausted infantrymen were forced to carry the fuel on foot past the idling armor. This agonizingly slow, manual transfer of liquid burned the one strategic resource Joachim Peiper absolutely could not afford to lose: daylight. The logistical triumph of capturing the American depot had instantly created a fatal tactical delay. The column was stationary. The massive engines were idling simply to prevent their components from freezing solid in the sub-zero temperatures. And while the Germans were passing jerry cans hand to hand in the snow, the initial shock of the Ardennes offensive was beginning to wear off for the Allied High Command. While Peiper was chained to the Bulge depot by his own desperate thirst for fuel, American combat engineers were rushing to exploit the fatal flaw in the German operational blueprint. The geography of the Ardennes is defined by deep, plunging river valleys, and Peiper's designated route required him to cross the Amblève and Somme rivers. The critical choke point in this sector was the small Belgian town of Trois Ponts, which literally translates to 3 bridges. If the German armored column could secure the crossings here, the road to the Meuse River would swing wide open, allowing the panzers to break out of the restrictive forests and into the open country. Recognizing the existential threat of the approaching spearhead, a small, lightly armed detachment from the American 51st Engineer Combat Battalion raced to the bridges. They lacked the heavy anti-tank artillery necessary to penetrate the sloped frontal armor of a Panther or a King Tiger. They could not possibly win a direct firefight against an elite SS Panzer division, but they did not need to destroy the tanks. They only needed to destroy the road beneath them. The engineers scrambled down the icy stone abutments of the bridges, frantically wiring the load-bearing supports with blocks of TNT and wrapping the structural beams in primacord. They worked in the freezing cold, listening to the approaching mechanical roar of the German column echoing through the steep valley. On December 18th, the leading elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled down the approach road toward Trois-Ponts. The vanguard of Panther tanks, fully refueled with American gasoline and riding a wave of renewed momentum, closed the distance rapidly. They were within a few hundred yards of the crossing, but just as the heavy armor prepared to secure the vital link, the American engineers slammed the detonator plungers. The bridge over the Amblev River disintegrated in a thunderous shockwave, sending massive chunks of stone, twisted steel, and splintered timber crashing into the freezing, fast-moving water below. Peiper's vanguard was abruptly halted at the lip of a smoking crater. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline he had just spent hours pumping into his tanks were entirely useless in the face of a 50-foot gap of rushing water. A 70-ton armored vehicle cannot swim, and it cannot fly. Denied the crossing, the massive German spearhead was forced to halt, reverse its lead elements, and pivot away from its optimal route. Peiper was compelled to order his entire column northward into the steep, narrow, and winding valley of the Amblev River, seeking an alternative route toward the villages of L'Église and Stumont. This forced detour triggered a cascading mechanical catastrophe. The new route was not a paved highway meant for a mechanized corps. It was a miserable, winding macadam track that clung precariously to the side of a steep, wooded gorge. By pushing thousands of heavy, tracked vehicles and wheeled supply trucks onto this fragile path, Peiper effectively doomed his own mobility. The column immediately began to choke on its own massive size. The physics of a military traffic jam are rigid and unforgiving. At the very front of the spearhead, the lead tanks were now constantly engaging small, stubborn pockets of American resistance. Every time the vanguard stopped to fire its heavy guns, the vehicle 10 feet behind it had to slam on its brakes. That halt rippled backward through the 15-mile-long column like a mechanical shockwave. Thousands of vehicles were forced into a grinding, stop-and-go crawl. Furthermore, the heavy, steel tracks of the Panthers and King Tigers acted like giant industrial tillers, violently chewing up the fragile road surface. Within hours, the route was transformed into a deep, impassable quagmire of freezing mud, churned earth, and shattered asphalt. This created a lethal divide within the battle group itself. While the tracked armor could slowly grind its way through the muck, the soft-skinned, wheeled supply trucks trailing behind, the very trucks carrying the ammunition, the infantry rations, and whatever captured fuel remained, became hopelessly bogged down. The column was fundamentally snapping in half. When a heavy tank slid off the icy camber of the narrow road and through a steel track, it instantly became an impenetrable roadblock. Because the route was hemmed in by a sheer rock wall on one side and a steep drop into the river on the other, following vehicles could not simply steer around the broken machine. The entire offensive was forced to halt, while heavy recovery half-tracks were slowly, painfully threaded through the congestion to drag the disabled tank out of the way. And during every single minute of this agonizing gridlock, thousands of massive Maybach engines sat idling in the freezing temperatures, quietly but relentlessly burning through the precious American gasoline they had captured just a day prior. A traffic jam was slowly draining the lifeblood of the German offensive. As the timeline collapsed and the invisible friction of the terrain ground the armored advance to a crawl, the intense frustration within the German ranks mutated into fanatical, ruthless violence. The men of Kampfgruppe Peiper were exhausted, operating under immense psychological pressure, deeply sleep-deprived, and heavily indoctrinated with a brutal ideological worldview. When they encountered resistance or captured prisoners, their response was merciless. At the Bonnier crossroads, near the town of Malmedy. This ruthlessness resulted in a horrific atrocity. More than 80 unarmed American prisoners of war, who had surrendered after a brief skirmish, were herded into a snowy field and systematically gunned down by SS troops. Similar brutal executions of captured soldiers and Belgian civilians occurred in Hansfeld, Stavelo, and surrounding hamlets as the column pushed violently forward. But in the cold, mathematical reality of mechanized warfare, this sheer brutality achieved the exact opposite of its intended tactical effect. Murdering prisoners did not repair a blown bridge. It did not extract a 70-ton tank from freezing mud, and it certainly did not magically deposit fuel into an empty gauge. Instead, it weaponized the enemy's resolve. Word of the Malmedy massacre spread through the disorganized American lines with lightning speed. The rumor mill amplified the horror, and American commanders began issuing unofficial, grim orders that SS troops were no longer to be taken alive. For the American GIs, many of whom were green replacements, combat engineers, or rear echelon clerks who had initially been terrified by the overwhelming armored onslaught, the calculus of battle fundamentally shifted. Surrender was no longer viewed as a guarantee of survival in a prisoner of war camp. It was seen as a guaranteed death sentence in a snowy field. Consequently, isolated American roadblocks, which might have yielded after a brief firefight a day earlier, now dug in and fought to the bitter end. A handful of determined infantrymen with a single bazooka or a hidden anti-tank gun were suddenly willing to die in place simply to hold a crossroads for just one more hour. And for Joachim Peiper, an extra hour of delay was a strategic disaster. His ruthlessness was heavily costing him time, the one resource his captured gasoline could never buy back. By now, the American Logistical Command fully understood the nature of the parasite they were fighting. The Allied generals realized that Kampfgruppe Peiper was not sustained by a secure, reliable supply line stretching back to the German border. It was a rogue predator desperately hunting for its next meal. So the Americans decided to systematically starve the beast. North of Peiper's current position, near the towns of Spa and Francorchamps, lay the ultimate operational prize: massive First Army supply depots holding millions of gallons of aviation fuel and vehicular gasoline. If Peiper's tanks managed to break northward out of the river valley and secured those dumps, the German drive to the Meuse would be virtually unstoppable, fully fueled for weeks of combat. The American quartermasters and combat engineers did not just prepare to defend the fuel, they prepared to sacrifice it entirely. As the First Army headquarters hastily evacuated the town of Spa, service troops remained behind with a singular, desperate mission: to deny the enemy at all costs. They worked frantically to load as many jerry cans and 55-gallon drums as possible onto retreating trucks, driving them completely out of the battle zone. But there were simply too many gallons and too few trucks to save it all. Knowing the German armored vanguard was only miles away, the engineers began unsealing the remaining drums. They poured hundreds of thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline directly into the drainage ditches, down the forested approach roads, and across the open fields. They stacked thermite grenades and rigged incendiary charges along the fuel-soaked perimeter. They were actively preparing to ignite a literal wall of fire across the Ardennes to blind and block the armored approach. Peiper was no longer advancing through a landscape rich with resources ready to be plundered. He was driving blindly into a deliberately sterilized battlefield. There would be no second logistical miracle like Bulge. The American military machine was actively burning its own lifeblood to ensure the heavy German armor would ultimately suffocate. And the Americans were not just burning the fuel ahead of him, they were aggressively slamming the heavy steel doors shut directly behind him. While Peiper pushed his heavy tanks violently forward into the tightening valley near Stumel, American infantry and armor from the 30th Infantry Division launched a determined, heavy counterattack at his rear. They descended on the town of Stavelo, a vital choke point Peiper had passed through just days earlier. After a fierce, bloody urban battle that cleared the streets of German defenders, the Americans recaptured the town and immediately blew the bridge over the Amblev River, permanently severing the German route. The trap had silently but definitively snapped shut. Peiper's massive armored spearhead was now entirely cut off from its own tail. The soft-skinned supply trucks, the infantry reinforcements, and the German Fuelbausers trying to catch up to the vanguard were hopelessly trapped on the wrong side of a destroyed bridge, facing stiffening American resistance. The 50,000 gallons of gasoline captured earlier were rapidly burning away, evaporating in the cold winter air as heavy tanks idled endlessly in traffic jams or engaged in bitter, static firefights they were never meant to fight. Peiper could no longer rely on the High Command's desperate strategy of moving sequentially from one captured filling station to the next. The available space for maneuver was violently shrinking, corralling the most powerful armored force in the German army into a narrow, muddy cage from which heavy steel could not easily escape. Inside that muddy cage, near the village of L'Église, the cold tactical reality finally dawned on the German commanders. They were no longer the tip of an unstoppable offensive spearhead. They were an isolated island of heavy steel, surrounded by a rapidly multiplying enemy. The umbilical cord connecting Kampfgruppe Peiper to the rest of the German military apparatus had not just been stretched, it had been definitively severed. While Peiper still possessed a terrifying concentration of king tigers and panthers, the entire logistical ecosystem required to keep those machines lethal was completely gone. The soft-skinned supply columns stranded behind the American lines were carrying far more than just the last dregs of German gasoline. They were carrying the high-explosive artillery shells, the specialized recovery gear needed to repair broken tracks, the medical supplies for mounting casualties, and the infantry rations. The grand operational blueprint dictated by Berlin, the desperate gamble to relentlessly push westward by parasitically living off the enemy's resources, had fundamentally collapsed. A mechanized force cannot live off the land when the enemy actively controls the geography, systematically obliterates the bridges, and deliberately sets its own fuel depots on fire. Peiper's men had captured 50,000 gallons of gasoline at Bulge, but they could not capture the American logistical network itself. Without a secure, uninterrupted supply chain of trucks shuttling back and forth along safe rear area roads, that initial prize had merely bought them a few extra miles of temporary reprieve. Now, the dynamic of the battle had violently inverted. The Americans were no longer just retreating and throwing up hasty roadblocks ahead of the column. They were aggressively compressing the pocket from all sides. Heavy U.S. artillery, safely positioned on the high ground overlooking the valley, began to relentlessly pound the stationary German armor. To make matters worse, the thick winter fog that had shielded the offensive from Allied air power was showing signs of breaking, threatening to expose the jammed vehicles to swarms of American fighter bombers. Every idling engine inside the shrinking perimeter was now burning a finite, entirely irreplaceable resource. The heavy steel tracks were sinking deeper into the freezing mud of the Ardennes. The trap was set, and the once unstoppable armored behemoth was about to find itself paralyzed. By the morning of December 23rd, the temperature inside the perimeter at L'Église had dropped below freezing, and the engines of the heavy armor were completely silent. For 36 hours, the surviving drivers had periodically starting the Maybach motors just to keep the lubricants from turning to sludge. But that desperate preservation had consumed the last of the Bulge gasoline. Now, when the starter buttons were pressed, there was no mechanical roar, only the dry, metallic click of empty relays. Peiper's command post, established in the cellar of the stone manor house at the center of the village, had become a center of mathematical paralysis. His staff officers spread out maps by candlelight, but the maps were irrelevant. Every single road leading out of L'Église was now held by the American 30th Infantry Division and the 3rd Armored Division. Heavy American 155mm artillery shells were systematically dismantling the stone buildings around them, raining slate and shattered timber onto the decks of the stationary armor. The Amblev River, swollen and freezing, blocked any attempt to maneuver south, while the demolished stone spans at Stumalt and Stavelot barred the east and west. At noon, Peiper radioed his corps commander, SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Monk, with an explicit final appraisal. His unit was out of fuel, out of artillery ammunition, and incapable of conducting mechanized combat. He requested permission to break out. The response from Berlin was a classic refusal of reality. Kampfgruppe Peiper was ordered to fight its way out, while bringing all of its tanks and heavy vehicles back to the German lines. Peiper looked at the silent 70-ton King Tigers parked in the mud outside his cellar window. The order was physically impossible. You cannot push 70 tons of dead steel through frozen mud without combustion. With no options left, Peiper made the only decision the geography and the fuel gauges allowed. He ordered the complete abandonment of the battle group's entire heavy inventory. Late that afternoon, the tank commanders climbed into their turrets for the last time, not to fight, but to set demolition charges. Thermite grenades were placed inside the open breeches of the 88mm guns. Fuel lines were slashed on the remaining support vehicles to drain any residual drops onto the floorboards, where incendiary fuses were wired to detonate after the troops had cleared the perimeter. Roughly 130 armored vehicles, including 17 King Tigers, dozens of Panthers, assault guns, and half-tracks, were left behind in the snow. At 1 o'clock on Christmas Eve, roughly 800 surviving soldiers filed silently out of the ruins of La Glaise, leaving their wounded behind with a German medic. The men who had crossed the line 6 days earlier as an elite, terrifying mechanized spearhead were reduced to freezing infantry, creeping through the icy woods on foot in the pitch black. The fuel they had seized from the enemy had propelled them deep into the trap, but it could not buy their way out. Looking back at the smoldering wreckage left behind at La Glaise, the ultimate lesson of the Ardennes offensive becomes brutally clear. Those 50,000 gallons of captured American gasoline at Bulge had delivered exactly what they promised: combustion. The fuel allowed massive engines to keep turning and heavy steel tracks to churn forward a few more miles into the freezing Belgian forests. But that was absolutely all it could do. A captured fuel dump is a static prize. It is not a functioning logistical system. Those 50,000 gallons could not magically rebuild the shattered stone arch at Trois Ponts. They could not widen a muddy single-lane logging trail to accommodate a 70-ton King Tiger, nor could they dispatch heavy recovery vehicles to clear a 15-mile traffic jam. The gasoline could not suppress American artillery, and it certainly could not secure a vulnerable rear echelon against a determined infantry counterattack. Peiper and the German High Command had fundamentally conflated the temporary possession of a raw resource with the actual capacity to project sustained military power. Their desperate gamble relied on a fatal misunderstanding of mechanized warfare. Berlin operated on the assumption that heavy tanks and a full fuel gauge were the only requirements for a successful armored breakthrough. But as the frozen, abandoned husks of Kampfgruppe Peiper proved, an offensive is an intricate, continuous ecosystem of time, terrain, engineering, and secure supply lines. The American forces did not need to defeat the elite German armor in a massive pitched tank battle. By methodically stripping away time, destroying the crossing points, and aggressively severing the road network, the Americans turned the terrifying weight of the German spearhead entirely against itself. The captured gasoline did not save the operation. It merely dictated the exact location where the operation would finally die. It allowed an isolated column to drive violently into a geographical cage, proving that a tactical prize can quickly become a strategic dead end. As the surviving troops trudged eastward through the freezing darkness, leaving their formidable King Tigers sitting silently in the snow, the grand illusion of the Ardennes offensive finally shattered. Joachim Peiper had successfully captured American gasoline, but in doing so, he discovered the fatal difference between merely possessing fuel and possessing the actual ability to wage mechanized war. The Third Reich had scraped together the heavy armor, and they had briefly stolen the combustion needed to move it. But in the winter of 1944, that was simply no longer enough. Germany still had the tanks, but the bridges, the roads, the time, and the logistical system itself already belonged to the enemy.